Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
I wonder where you think we might judge Brexit long after you and I have gone in 100 years' time.
I profoundly hope it will be seen as a restoration of normality and the status quo, namely a great nation once again standing up and taking the reins of its own direction.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. Now, not long ago, in a time pre-pandemic, before Boris Johnson was PM and when Harry and Meghan were still on UK soil, this show was known as Chopper's Brexit Podcast. Then we rebranded because, well, Brexit had been done, it'd all been tied up with a neat bow and sorted out with a Get Brexit Done label and all that. Ah yes, well, not quite as it turned out. Now, as we record this podcast, Boris Johnson is packing his overnight bag for Brussels to meet with Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, in an effort to salvage the Brexit trade deal negotiations. So it seemed appropriate to go back to our roots and focus firmly on Brexit this week, as we roll closer and closer to finding out whether we'll get a trade deal or not. The sticking points in the negotiations are the same as they've been for months. State aid, the enforcement of any deal, and fishing rights. So later in this podcast, I'll be joined by Elspeth Macdonald, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, to talk about whether the importance of fish in the Brexit talks is a red herring. That joke was copyright Louisa Wells, this podcast producer. Plus, this week we learnt that the UK and EU have resolved the issues regarding the Irish border in a key step towards a final Brexit trade deal. As a result, the government has withdrawn the controversial law-breaking measures from the UK Internal Market Bill. And we'll talk to somebody who expressed concerns about those measures at the time, former Tory Attorney General Geoffrey Cox. But first, deal or no deal, the outcome of the talks with Brussels threatened to make or break Boris Johnson's political legacy. So as we hurtle towards the end of December, will the result be viewed as a Maastricht moment or a moment of triumph? Now, early this week, David Jones, the Vice Chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs, joined me, and I asked him what advice he'd give the PM ahead of that key meeting with the President of the European Commission.
I have no doubt at all that Boris is very well aware of how he became Prime Minister. He became Prime Minister by having a landslide election result in which those people, especially in the north of England, in the red wall seats, who had voted to leave the European Union, relied upon him to deliver that. And I know, and I have every confidence in him, that that is what he's going to do. He's going to preside over the return of British sovereignty.
What do you think is at stake here for Boris Johnson? Do you think that he'll be judged by Brexit and the deal he gets, even more so than his response to the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, this is the defining moment of Boris's prime ministership. And this is what will, I think, secure him a place in history. Boris, of course, was one of the leaders of the Vote Leave campaign. He's been there since the very start. And now, at this crucial moment, he's got to show that he will keep faith with the British people and ensure that we recover our sovereignty. And that, I think, will be the legacy that he leaves.
Do you worry we could be facing another Maastricht situation in the sense that we get this extraordinary 800-page treaty to digest very, very quickly before being pushed through Parliament? Do you worry about that?
Well, I don't think that must happen. As you say, it looks as if it's going to be a very lengthy document. We in the European Research Group are going to live up to our name, and we're going to do some pretty heavy research into what is brought back from Brussels. And I don't think that the government expects parliamentarians to be bounced into approving a treaty that will require some scrutiny. So I think that we will need the time. We'll work very quickly on it, but nevertheless, we need sufficient time in order to digest it properly.
How much time do you need? Are you cancelling Christmas, David Jones?
I have a funny feeling that Christmas may be a bit abbreviated this year, certainly. But, that's a small price to pay to make sure that you get the sort of result that you want. When you ask how much time we need, well, it depends. It depends on how long the document is, and it depends on what concerns we have when we look through the document. But what we will be doing is looking through it very, very closely indeed. As I say, we are the European Research Group. We will do our research.
There were some pitfalls, weren't there, in Theresa May's deal, and in fact the deal that was agreed last October, this problem that the UK has with this protocol, that gives the EU a degree of sovereignty over Northern Ireland. I mean, will you spot for those kind of errors, or not errors, but those kind of problems?
I think that, we have to look back on the approval of the withdrawal agreement, and we have to recognise that that agreement actually contained obligations on the part of the European Union to negotiate a new free trade agreement using best endeavours and acting in good faith. I think we relied upon the EU to do that, and to be entirely frank, they didn't perform their part of the bargain. There's an old saying, that's fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And I think that we will be looking very carefully at the text to make sure that there aren't any elephant traps lurking somewhere in the wording.
Is your single red line one word, sovereignty?
That is the ultimate test of whether or not this will be an agreement that parliamentarians should accept. That was the key issue at the time of the referendum in 2016, whether this country was to become an independent country once again and recover its sovereignty. And I think that every parliamentarian will be looking through the text of this document to make sure that that is what it delivers, that it restores sovereignty to the British people and their parliament.
I was talking to a senior colleague of yours in ERG last week, and it's very rare for ERG to speak at all publicly right now, so we do appreciate you coming on. They described sovereignty as you remove Britain from the kind of circle of the EU, and the line that might be the circle of Britain can't touch the bigger one, that's the EU. There must be a complete sort of a blue line between the two to indicate different, contiguous but sovereign areas.
Yes, and the key issue, of course, is the role of the European Court of Justice, because the sovereignty of the European Union resides in the European Court of Justice. So if there's any continuing role for the ECJ, it can't be said that we've recovered our sovereignty. So that will be one big thing that we will be looking for, to make sure that there is no continuing role for the European Court of Justice after we've left the transition period at the end of this year.
On the point of fisheries, that's also about sovereignty. They're UK sovereign waters, which we can then allow access to French or Spanish or Norwegian trawlers. That's the point of that, isn't it?
Yeah, we need to have control over who accesses our waters. And it's very odd that the EU are making such a big deal of this, because they have annual agreements, for example, with Norway on access to their fishing waters. And what we're asking for is precisely the same as they've already agreed with Norway, and that is the position that the British government has got to maintain.
And the level playing field, likewise, that's essentially state aid rules have got to be fair across both the UK and EU, is that right? Or we should be able to establish our own state aid rules, that's the point?
Absolutely. The future of this country does depend upon our having an independent state aid policy. And if the European Union expects to have any say in that, then I think that the British government must very quickly disabuse them of that, because it's something that's completely unacceptable and, once again, is not compatible with British sovereignty.
And the third area, as discussed, is arbitration. That's the European Court of Justice, isn't it? I mean, how do you rule on any disputes between the two sovereign groups?
Well, as I've just said, the European Court of Justice is where the sovereignty of the EU resides, and it must have no role at all. And, it would be quite impossible for us to enter into an agreement with another party whereby the Supreme Court of that party had the final say on any disputes between us and them. That's got to go, and I've no doubt at all, I have every confidence that that is the position that Boris Johnson and David Frost will continue to adopt.
What are the risks of a bad deal, do you think? Nigel Farage is on the lookout for the betrayal narrative, isn't he? I mean, you've got May elections next year, big elections for the Tory party on the Shire local Tory front. What are the risks for the Conservatives?
Well, the principal issue is this. We made a promise to the British people at the time of the last election in December that we would deliver what they voted for in 2016. The British people have very long memories, and if they felt that they were not getting what they voted for, then they would bear that very much in mind when they came to decide who they supported in future elections. I understand that. I'm entirely sure that Boris Johnson understands that. And what I'm also sure of is that is what he has every intention of delivering, of keeping faith with the British people and making sure that we are once again a sovereign country at the end of the transition period.
So what you're saying, without any exaggeration, is that what could be at stake is the Conservative Party's ability to win the next general election on this deal. I mean, it's quite early on in the Parliament, but that's how big it is.
Well, it's actually even bigger than that, Chris. What we're talking about is the future of this country as an independent nation. This is probably the most important time politically since the Great Revolution of 1688. I mean, it's that big. It's a moment of history. And it's up to Boris Johnson now to seize the moment and to secure his place in history. Because if he is the man who ultimately redelivers the sovereignty of the British people, then he will go down as a very great Prime Minister indeed. And I believe that he's got that in him.
And the risk against that is being seen as Edward Heath, isn't it? Who is accused by Brexiteers nowadays of selling out the UK on fish in the 70s.
Yes, I think that was not the finest moment in the history of the Conservative Party. And we all corporately have got a duty to make amends for that because it was a very, very shameful time. I think that if we can recover the sovereignty of our waters and make sure that our fishermen have the right to fish there unimpeded by European regulations, then again, we will have gone a long way to making amends for what happened back in 1972.
How do you see the next few days playing out, David Jones? Is it possible they might try and park the fishing issue because that's tied up with France and the French elections just 2 years away, and then do the other bits first and then leave fish for a later date? Or is that not acceptable to you?
Well, actually, I think that fisheries is an issue that could be dealt with separately, but has got to be dealt with separately now. It shouldn't be bound up in a larger treaty. It should be a standalone agreement of the sort, to repeat, that the EU have got with Norway, and it should continue on that basis and be reviewed periodically. And I don't think that, having had the experience of the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, we would be at all comfortable parking the issue of fisheries until a later date. We want that resolved now.
So, David Jones, we sit here recording this on Tuesday. What are the odds, do you think, of getting a deal or leaving without one?
That depends entirely upon the European Union. I think that the British government has made its position absolutely clear. If the European Union want to have a deal with us, then now is the time for them to say so. Otherwise, then we will leave without a deal. We'll make our own way in the world, as we have done for centuries. And we'll be happy to trade with the European Union, but we will be trading with other countries right around the world as well and striking our own free trade agreements. This is a great country. This is one of the largest economies in the world. We've got plenty of inventive people who are entrepreneurial and know how to do business. And we will succeed in business, whether it's with or without the European Union. Ideally, we would like a free trade agreement with them as we would with every other country. But if they don't want to do it, and if they want to continue to exert control over this country, then they have got to understand that that is completely rejected and we won't go along with it.
David Jones, Vice Chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, if you feel fully stirred by David Jones's Brexit rhetoric, please write and tell us. Email us at chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk or tell others about us on Twitter @chopperspodcast. Now, stay with us. Coming up, we'll be talking to the best voice in Westminster, Geoffrey Cox QC MP, right after this.
It begins as a love story. Couples who meet as young activists, bonded in a fight against injustice.
We seem to have similar outlooks in life. He often made me feel very special.
It felt like we were in love. I remember it being quite magical.
As far as I was concerned, we had a future together.
I fully did envisage my future with him.
But then he starts acting strangely.
Suddenly there were secrets and there were inconsistencies and there were things that didn't make sense.
Then one day he leaves.
I came home from work and I realised immediately that he'd gone.
Vanishes without a trace. And the reason why these men disappear is so disturbing, it's led to a formal apology from the state.
I never for a moment thought that it would be what it actually turned out to be.
This is Bed of Lies, the true story of one of the biggest scandals in recent British history, and the latest podcast from the Telegraph.
Talk about the Stasi in East Germany. That's not how we understand our society.
A tale that travels from the safety of a loving bedroom to the very heart of the law. Search for Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
And we're back. Now, this time last year, we just had a general election and we were recording this podcast in its rightful home, the Red Lion pub on Whitehall. And 12 months ago, one of my esteemed guests was Geoffrey Cox QC MP for Torridge and West Devon and former Attorney General. And our conversation then started like this. Can leavers relax now? Is Brexit going to happen?
The government will carry out its promises. Simple as that. We'll be leaving on the 31st of January. Prime Minister has got a great majority. He won a fantastic and resounding victory, and that will bring order and decisiveness to what was previously chaos and paralysis. What a wicked laugh, Chris. What a wicked laugh.
Geoffrey Cox in Devon. Decisiveness, chaos, paralysis. That was a year ago. What's happened? What's gone wrong?
Well, nothing's gone wrong. We left the European Union on the 31st of January. We will leave the transition period and the transition arrangements on the 1st of January next year. And those things were pledged. They were not certain before this Prime Minister was elected. They are certain now.
Are you surprised by all this last-minute haggling, this horse trading we're seeing with Boris Johnson flying today, Wednesday, or trading it to Brussels?
Not in the least. It's standard practice. I had a little bit of experience of this myself, and it doesn't surprise me one bit. I think that the government has pursued a dogged and determined course to get the best deal for this country. I still think there's a very good chance, and if anybody could do it, it's this Prime Minister.
And you're an eminent barrister par excellence. Do you blame pesky lawyers for these negotiations? Are they missing the big picture?
No, they are wrestling over two or three core problems. One of them is, how do you balance, in any free trade agreement with the European Union, proper respect for UK sovereignty, and on the other hand, a proper accommodation of the single market, which the EU regards as its most precious asset. And those two things are difficult to reconcile. The EU takes an imperialistic view of the single market and its jurisdiction over it. In other words, it acknowledges no other authority, and you can understand why. It is the central achievement of the European Union. On the other hand, this government is determined to vindicate British sovereignty, and those two things are difficult to reconcile, but not impossible, and I hope it will be done.
In your barnstorming speech at the Tory party conference in 2018, which I've been told I can't play again on this podcast by the producer, because every time you come on, I play it. So I love it. So it was such a marvellous speech. But you said there that we needn't fear self-government, and you also quoted the Rolling Stones, as you would, saying you can't always get what you want. I wonder, which is it? I mean, can we get self-government, or can't we have all the fish?
No, we can get self-government, and we are getting self-government. Any free trade agreement, to some extent, requires the observation of international legal obligations, and to the extent that you are constrained by those obligations, which you voluntarily entered into, well, I suppose in some respect your sovereignty is mitigated. But those are voluntary and withdrawable obligations. A trade agreement can at any stage be, as the lawyers put it, denounced. It can be withdrawn from. It is not a permanent arrangement, and if the United Kingdom wished to withdraw from those trading arrangements, then on the giving of appropriate notice it could do so. The problem and the objection that many had to the deal last year that was proposed was that it was permanent, as I advised, as you recall, back in March 2019. But a trade agreement is not permanent, And so I think people should relax a bit about this. This is a completely and fundamentally different arrangement we're entering into than the sorts of things we were considering last year with customs unions and a permanent backstop. This is not that, and I think we need to be as flexible as we can be while respecting our own sovereignty.
Are you relieved there's no mention of a backstop this time round?
Well, the backstop issue's gone. We signed up to an arrangement in October last year, and Michael Gove has been negotiating, sounds like very successfully, and come to agreements in the last 48 hours.
And those agreements mean that we needn't now breach international law if we get a deal. So that's good news.
Well, we needn't ever have breached international law, Chris. I mean, you know my views on that. I think that was a mistake. But look, if it's got us to where we need to be in the Joint Committee, I'm delighted. I congratulate Michael Gove. I think this has been a tremendous success for both sides, really, and I very much hope we can emulate it on the wider stage of a future relationship.
Is the vision of Brexit still there? Can you see it? Are we still? I mean, the idea was good once.
Look, we have regained our self-government, Chris. From now on, it will not be necessary for an MP for 40% of our laws to say, go and see your MEP if you know who he is. There'll be direct accountability for the whole sphere of public policy making in the British National Assembly, namely the House of Commons, and that is a tremendous thing.
You mentioned now the 40% of laws that will no longer be decided in Brussels. That means that you guys have got to work a bit harder. That means MPs and officials and the government structure that we fund as taxpayers have got to do 40% more work.
Well, we've got to do what we used to do right up until the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s. We have to govern ourselves like hundreds of countries around the world, like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. They all govern themselves. They have not surrendered law-making capabilities and powers to a supranational organization with aspirations to become a political entity. That project was one which I've always believed was not one to which the UK could happily and easily subscribe, and so it has proven.
When can we judge whether Brexit has been a success, do you think, Geoffrey Cox?
I don't think for many years. I think that the mistake people make is trying to analyse this in the terms of the next deadline, if you'll pardon the expression, Chris, the next deadline for a column or the next election. These kinds of historic turning points in a nation's character and destiny are, in my view, only judged over decades, maybe even longer. They shape the future for 100 years or more. And I think that that this is something we'll need to look at and history will look at, and we can't really see its shape for many years to come.
Will you be pronouncing on the deal?
I certainly will, looking at it very closely and with professional interest. I hope we have one. I think there is one, as is often said, to be done. I think this Prime Minister, if anybody, can do it. And I think it will be a thoroughly acceptable one.
Your legal advice in March 2019, I think, was key, really, in ending up where we are now, because in that advice, you said this would lead us tied to the EU in perpetuity. I mean, if Brexit were a baby, if Boris Johnson were the father, Nigel Farage is a rather roguish uncle who likes a scotch, what is Geoffrey Cox?
What an appalling image you conjure up. I think I'm going to have to leave that to other people to judge. I think I played a very modest role in it, but I was proud to be part of a generation that has reasserted the self-government and independence of the British people.
Do you think this will be the start of a trend? Do you forecast anything similar on the continent, maybe in Italy or other countries?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, Chris. I mean, I remember when I was studying history, I had a history teacher who used to say that the British usually got their revolutions in earlier than the continent, who followed within a few decades or within 100 years. I don't think that Brexit is a phenomenon that is unique to this country, because I think its mainsprings are very complicated and they involve the sense of disempowerment of millions of people and the reassertion of democratic control. And I think that movement, that current, will eventually cross Europe, cross the channel into Europe.
And that might lead to the breakup of the European Union at some point.
Well, it might lead to its adaptation. The problem with the EU is it's very poor at adaptation. The great thing about the UK constitution is that it is good at adaptation. And I think what we are doing, and it will be seen over the next year, 10 years, 20 years, we are adapting to a fundamental change in people's thinking and mood. And if the EU does not adapt, then it will face problems. That's my personal belief. I do think that people are feeling that the modern development, both constitutional developments, the EU, have taken away from them something very important, which is a sense of control of their own lives. That's why the motto, the marching song of the campaign for leaving was, of course, taking back control. It's a very potent image. People feel that things are beyond their control, and this was an assertion of it. And direct democratic accountability is the only means we have of asserting some kind of control.
Do you think the arrival of Joe Biden in the White House means that populism has taken a dent? Do you think? Is that where we're going, do you think? If it's back to normal?
I don't acknowledge, certainly not in Britain, this view, that this word populism. It's used as a pejorative term. What it is a reassertion of the ordinary man and woman's central role in governing themselves. What has happened over 20, 30, 40 years is that gradually power has been transferred to committees, to, I hesitate to use the word, it's a cliche, but to elites, to judges, to all kinds of the good and the great. But more and more the sense of democratic sway being able to be held by ordinary people has diminished and etiolated. And I am certain that this is a reaction against that and something that is for the good, not the bad.
And where would you rank Brexit? We've had David Jones, who's the vice chairman of the ERG, as you know, on this podcast this week. He ranks it alongside the Glorious Revolution. I wonder where you think we might judge Brexit long after you and I have gone in 100 years' time.
Another very good question as ever, Chris. I think it will be seen, I profoundly hope it will be seen, as a restoration of normality and the status quo, namely a great nation that has given and shone a light, has had many flaws and failings, but has shone a light for other nations at critical times in the world's history, once again standing up and taking the reins of its own direction. That, I think, will be seen as a restoration of normality, because you have to remember, this was a country that governed itself for hundreds of years, and for but 45, we surrendered that government increasingly. Now we've taken it back. I think it's the right thing to do, and I hope that is how history will judge it.
Well, Geoffrey Cox, thank you. I can't really give you a round of applause in the studio on my own here, but I would like to. I think that was a marvellous summary of what Brexit is meant to mean. Now, last year, you kind of did a reading for us for Christmas.
Yes.
I wonder if you might do the same again this year. Do you mind? I know we're not together this year. We're not in the pub together.
Sadly not. I'd very much
treat
like
you to a
be,
drink.
Chris. Quite.
But would you mind doing that?
Of course, yes. No, I'm to be delighted.
Well, stick around then, listeners, and shortly you'll get to hear Geoffrey's euphonious Christmas reading at the end of the show. Now, for months and maybe for years on this podcast, I've been saying that fish is the dog that hasn't barked in the EU talks. Well, the fish is barking this week, or perhaps mewing like a catfish. Anyway, you get my point. Yet again, fishing is the key sticking point in talks between Britain and the European Union. It's been the same for decades, going back to Edward Heath's time.
We want to turbocharge the Scottish fishing sector. They would allow Brussels to charge for our turbot.
No more carping. It'll put the fear of cod into listeners. I'll leave you to mull it over. Soon even Nicola Sturgeon might want to come onto this podcast. Okay, no more fish puns, I promise. But someone who's probably sick of them is Elspeth Macdonald, Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. Elspeth Macdonald, Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, welcome to Choppers Politics.
Good morning, thank you.
Before we start, is it fishermen or fishers?
Fishermen is the name of the organisation. And in our membership, I have to say it is mainly men. I don't think we've got any female fishers in our membership, although there are some female fishers in Scotland.
But no plan to change your name of the Federation?
Not at the moment. Not at the moment.
Let's wait and see. Now, the usual caveats apply. Let's talk Brexit. Nuts and bolts. How big is the UK fishing fleet at the moment, if you can talk about the UK rather than just Scotland?
Vessel-wise for the UK, I don't have the numbers to hand, but in terms of the numbers of fishers in the UK, I think it's about 12,000, and we've got about 5,000 of those in Scotland. We've got just over 2,000 vessels, and within our federation, our membership is about 450 vessels.
So it is quite small in terms of the UK economy. Do you think the importance of fish has been overblown in these talks, given it's one of the three areas where there's no agreement at the moment, as we stand?
No, I don't think it's been overblown at all, because I think I think to some extent it's become emblematic of the Brexit negotiations, because it's such an important opportunity for us to right the wrongs of the past and to right the wrongs of the common fisheries policy. And I think this is a real opportunity. I think you've probably heard us talk about the sea of opportunity for us to really reinvigorate our fishing industry, not just in Scotland, but around the UK. The key thing that we absolutely must ensure that we have is the ability to control access to our fishing waters. So the ability to control our exclusive economic zone, that's what we have not had control of under the common fisheries policy. Controlling access to our waters, having a fairer share of the resources in those waters, and undertaking annual negotiations with the EU and fishing opportunities, just as the EU does with other independent coastal states. So we're not seeking anything special. We just want exactly the same sorts of arrangements that they have with others.
And sovereignty would mean that you couldn't have Norwegian trawlers coming into within that space, or Icelandic vessels, or further south vessels from France.
Well, you could do if you decided that was what you wanted to do.
Yes.
And that's the really important point here. We don't have the ability to control that access for the EU fleet under the CFP. But as an independent coastal state, what we must have, or what we really should have, is the ability to determine who gets to fish for what and when in our waters.
Yep.
So it's certainly not about there being no access for other vessels, but it's about the UK being able to negotiate that access with others.
The European Union offered last week to the UK 15 to 18% of our fish back. I wondered what that means to a layman, because fish are underwater. How do you know who owns the fish, if you see what I mean?
Well, there's a really good way, and a way that we really want to be used in future for our relationship with the EU, called zonal attachment. And zonal attachment is basically a scientific method that is well established, and it's exactly what the EU uses in its negotiations with Norway. And basically it allows you to determine where fish actually are, and it allows allocation of fishing opportunities to be based on a much more science-based approach in terms of where fish are born, where they are spawned, where they have their juvenile feeding grounds, where they are as adults, because fish don't respect geographic borders.
Yeah,
they move
right.
around. They move around. But zonal attachment is a well-established methodology that is used to allocate resources, but it's not used under the CFP within European waters. And that's what we want to see going forward in the UK's relationship with the EU in future.
Do you think there's any chance that fishing will be parked, because it's so controversial? I mean, with an election coming up in France, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is unlikely to do a deal which could be seen to selling out his French fishers.
I guess it's possibly because the position on fisheries is very polarised. It's not easy to see a clear landing zone that both parties could be happy with. So that's certainly possible. And I think in lots of ways that would not be problematic from the UK side, because there is already an established infrastructure, if you like, for annual negotiations, annual talks between coastal states in this part of the world. So at this time of year, we would generally be sitting down up until this point as part of an EU delegation, but going forward, the UK in its own right, to have bilateral discussions with Norway, discussions with the Faroe Islands, discussions through something called the Coastal States Forum, where we talk about the migratory stock. So there is an existing infrastructure of annual negotiations on fisheries that we could use if fisheries talks through the Brexit negotiations were parked. I think that would be much more problematic for the EU fleet than it would be for the UK one, to be honest.
Yes, it sounds like it would be de facto giving us sovereignty over all the waters by doing that, wouldn't it?
Well, absolutely, because the EU fleet would have no right of access to UK waters from the end of this year. And without a fisheries agreement between the parties, there would be nothing to set out the framework or the principles by how that would happen. But that it wouldn't prevent us from sitting down and discussing it. But there would be no framework agreement in place.
It's an extraordinary time, isn't it? I mean, but there's a real chance, though, surely, for a renaissance of our coastal villages, coastal towns, coastal cities, isn't there, from the right kind of deal? And that's understood, isn't it, by Boris Johnson, who relied a lot on Scottish Tory votes, because the Tories are seen to be the ones who will fight hardest for the rights of fishermen, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister saw it for himself when he came to Scotland last summer. He came to Scotland, he came to Peterhead, which is the biggest whitefish port in Europe. And he saw for himself the scale of that market, the businesses that surround it, that are not just those catching fish, but those involved in all the other aspects of the supply chain. I mean, we believe that there's the capacity to double the amount of raw material that the industry in Scotland catches. So that's pretty significant.
Is that fish, raw material?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry. So, I mean, there's a good way of demonstrating the scale of opportunity. So at the moment, the UK fleet only catches somewhere in the region of 30 to 40% of all the fish that are caught in UK waters. So that figure varies little from year to year, but it's...
And if that doubles that figure, that's quite a big deal.
There's the potential to double that. If you compare that to Norway, our near neighbours across the North Sea, the Norwegian fleet catches in the region of about 85% of all the fish that are taken from their waters.
Yeah.
So, it's potentially a really significant uplift for the fishing industry and for the communities that depend upon it.
Are you in touch quite closely with Lord Frost and the team negotiating with Michel Barnier?
Yes, we are obviously in contact with DEFRA, who are the department leading the negotiations from a fishery perspective. So we keep in regular contact with them. We've had meetings with Lord Frost. And I think it's really encouraging that they share our view that this is a tremendous opportunity. Sovereignty is a principle and not something that you can compromise on, and that they really support our efforts to get a really good outcome from these negotiations for us.
And just finally, Elspeth, the next few days, how will they pan out? We're talking early this week when there is no deal at the moment. We're expecting Boris Johnson to head to Brussels at some point, maybe Wednesday this week. How will the next few days pan out?
Oh, I don't know. Goodness, I don't have a crystal ball. It's hard to predict, isn't it? But I think from a fishing perspective, we've been very heartened by the commitment and the consistent messaging from the UK government that they see, as we do, the importance of getting the right outcome for the fishing industry from these negotiations, and that they don't intend to compromise on our ability to control access to our own waters and to have a greater share of the resources within them.
Well, Elspeth Macdonald, Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, but it may be the renaissance of the fishing industry that many of us have wanted to see for a long time. So best of luck.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all until next week, when we may or may not have a Brexit deal. Before I leave you with Geoffrey Cox's dulcet tones, a quick thank you for my guests this week, David Jones MP, Geoffrey Cox QC MP, of course, and Elspeth Macdonald. To my producers, Louisa Wells, Theo Luludis and Elliot Lampett, and to you for listening, wherever you are. Don't forget you can get 30 days free access to the Telegraph's best content by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. And after your 30 days, it's just £2 a week. Do consider it. Subscribers make this podcast happen. And of course, if you can and can afford it, please buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Now finally, earlier I promised you the mellifluous tones of Geoffrey Cox QC MP with a Christmas reading. And I can't let you down, dear, dear listeners. So to see us out, here is Geoffrey Cox QC MP with a reading from A Christmas Carol.
Scrooge wakes up on Christmas Day. From A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, Jovial, stirring, cold, piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. "What's today?" cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. "Eh?" returned the boy, with all his might of wonder. "What's today, my fine fellow?" said Scrooge. "Today," replied the boy. "Why, Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day," said Scrooge to himself. "I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hallo, my fine fellow." "Hallo," returned the boy. "Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner?" Scrooge inquired. "I should hope I did," replied the lad. "An intelligent boy," said Scrooge. "A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one." "What? The one as big as me?" returned the boy. "What a delightful boy," said Scrooge. "It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck." "It's hanging there now," replied the boy. "Is it?" said Scrooge. "Go and buy it." "Walker!" exclaimed the boy. "No," said Scrooge, "I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown." The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger, who could have got a shot off half so fast. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's," whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. "He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim."